we have a spicy topic about marriage, and we're talking about baggage in marriage and whether couples should tell each other everything about their past before they get married to avoid conflict. I received an email a few weeks ago from a listener who said she's in her 50s and newly married, and her new husband recently found out some things about her past. I think she brought it up, and it has created some distrust and conflict. They've only been married for a few months, and apparently he didn't know about her past before they got married. So she did say he is a Christian, but doesn't really read his Bible. So he's struggling to see that her past is not who she is anymore. So now what? What can they do to get through this? And she said he had her up on this pedestal as a Christian woman, and now he's very upset. So, what do you do when you bring baggage into the marriage? When you get engaged, should you tell your husband about your past, or do you say, well, God has saved me and I'm not that person anymore? Is, isn't that a good question? I think it's a good question because some people will say their spouse doesn't need to know because it's history and it's not who they are anymore. And by the way, you weren't around when all this happened. We'll see about that. Some will say that you shouldn't have any secrets. So you should tell your spouse everything, and make sure they know it. But it's tricky. I think it's tricky. So here's what we're going to talk about today. One, what is baggage and how is it carried into a relationship, specifically marriage? Again, defining terms is so important. So what one person might consider is baggage, somebody else may not. So I think it's good for us to talk about what that is. And then what constitutes a secret in marriage, and should there be secrets that you keep from your spouse or anything about you in particular that your spouse doesn't know? And then we're going to break down 1 Corinthians 13 and what it teaches us about how to be a better spouse by choosing to love our spouse, even when we don't feel it. Like when you've lost that love and feeling, how do you still show love? Before we get into today's episode, this is the last call for the Women of Worth event on May 10th at Tremont Church of God in Easley, South Carolina. Actually, I lied. It's not the last call because it's 2 weeks away. But if you want to register for that because you're in the South Carolina area, go to mytremont.churchcenter.com/register. And honestly, I put the link in the show notes because the link is a little bit weird to me. So if you have any trouble, either email me or you can email the church. You get dinner and a great time of fellowship for only $10. I think that's really good. I don't know what we're eating, but for $10, you can't really go wrong, can you? Also, if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a 5-star rating and review. It's the only way to get the podcast into the earbuds of others is just by leaving a 5-star rating and review if you can. If you don't want to leave the review, just please leave a 5-star rating. If you enjoy the podcast, I don't want you to lie for me, but I would really appreciate that because again, this podcast is not monetized. So that's kind of like, hey, I appreciate what you give to us. Here's my 5 stars. So that would be great. So let's look at what baggage is. We call anything that we can't get over and continue to carry throughout the years baggage. But I'm going to get more specific for you. The older you are, the more baggage you'll have. So I think that makes sense, right? Because that's just life. And if you get married when you're older, then the more baggage you're going to carry into that relationship because you've lived longer, you've had more life experiences, and chances are you've had those accumulation of past hurts and emotional baggage over the years. Most of the time, the baggage is emotional, things that bother you. It's the way that you handle your emotions, the things that you get emotional over. Baggage is something that we continue to deal with because if you can carry it, then you can lay it down. But if you can carry it, you can also refuse to lay it down. That means that you have to be able to identify what your baggage is so you can deal with it. The best way to identify baggage is to identify the things that you can't get over. When someone says something to you that brings up an unforgiven event, you can't wait to unload on them. I think our culture today, it's an overused word and I don't like it, but I'm going to say it because this is what we use. It's your triggers. Okay. The things that quote unquote trigger you. Okay. I think our culture uses that, like I said, as an overused term. I've been talking about this culture that talks about therapy and has to be, have a lot of therapy all the time starting young for kids, and then you get this diagnosis, and we talk about the traumas and triggers. But to keep up with the cultural lingo to help us identify baggage, I think it's those things that you would say trigger you. And again, it's like, oh, you just triggered me. I can't wait to unload. People might call this baggage, but it's really just unforgiveness. I mean, we're looking at this from a biblical point of view, too, right? A biblical perspective. So, on the biblical side of things, if you're not getting over something and you can't wait to unload on somebody, then it's a forgiveness issue, but you're still carrying that around as what we would call baggage. You're harboring things in your relationships that have not been dealt with. And if you move on from that into another relationship without dealing with it, then you carry that into the new relationship. It's just what's going to happen. And we talked about this in the God Hates Divorce episode. Remember, what we call baggage is something that we carry into relationships with us. And if you can carry it, you can lay it down. I'm going to say that a few times in this episode because I think it's important for us to remember, like, if you carry it, then you're choosing to carry it and not deal. And I think that sometimes people kid themselves and say that they're over these past hurts or they can easily move on from past hurts, but they haven't dealt with it. And maybe they're just having a good day today and they think that they've moved on. But if there's a trigger and it triggers you, then it's probably baggage. So saying moved on is not the same as dealing with the hurt. And we'll talk about how to do that soon. On One Focus on the Family article says language like you always or you never should be an indicator that there are some unresolved issues that you haven't dealt with, AKA baggage. Now, remember, I'm not a counselor or a psychologist, and I won't pretend to be. And I will bring everything back to the Bible, but marriage is already hard anyways. It can be challenging at times because you're dealing with two sinful people and you're dealing with two imperfect people. You're going to get angry at your spouse. You're going to have your good times and your bad times. You're going to have ups and downs. You're going to have miscommunications and misunderstandings. You are going to get your feelings hurt and you're going to hurt the feelings of your spouse. I've done that to my spouse. He's done that to me. And that's marriage. Okay. That's a relationship, really. I mean, my parents have hurt my feelings. I'm sure I've hurt their feelings. I'm sure I've hurt my kids' feelings. They've hurt mine. Again, that's just relationships. But one psychologist said that the three types of baggage that can crush your marriage are childhood baggage, financial baggage, and relationship baggage. So, again, if you get married young, which is again what I suggest. I'm really hoping and praying that my kids find their spouses young but I don't have any control over that. But if I could, I would. But if you get married young, then as long as you're equally yoked, again, that's where I stand with it, and you're both walking in a relationship with the Lord. I think that's a good thing. Then you're not going to have that much baggage. We are all imperfect human beings again, so there will always be something to work on, but we're specifically talking about baggage and defining what that is as you take it into your marriage. So let's look at each one of these areas of baggage that the psychologist says can crush your marriage and just kind of get an understanding of what that might be. So let's first look at childhood baggage. First of all, no one's family is perfect, and everyone's family is dysfunctional in some way. Dysfunction means abnormal or healthy behavior in a group. When I was growing up, my mom and dad had a minivan, and me and my brother and sister we'd all arrive to church in the minivan, and the kids from the youth group would say our family was a perfect family because we were intact, and a lot of their families were broken or they come from difficult homes. I would say it's a lot easier to look at families from the outside and say, "Oh, you guys have a perfect family, it's perfect relationship," but nobody's perfect. And I would always tell them that even at my age as a teenager, I'd be like, no, we're not even close. So from time to time, there's going to be some dysfunction, no matter how quote unquote perfect that family looks. And we can't feel bad about that. Even me and my husband and our boys, there's dysfunction in our family because we're not perfect. And one of the things I told the ladies at the retreat this past weekend is that we live in a world post Garden of Eden where nothing is perfect. We have to understand that sometimes, well, a lot of times, that's just how life is going to be. And it's going to affect every aspect of our life, our marriage, and our parenting, specifically, since that's what we're talking about. So, based on the stats from the God Hates Divorce episode, children have major issues as a result of divorce not necessarily as a result of, you know, the typical dysfunction of families due to the fact that we're imperfect people. And you've heard all of them, so I won't go back over those. If you don't remember what those are, then go back to that. But if you come from a family that's divorced, then you're going to have baggage. If you even come from families where dad's not present, but maybe he hasn't left the family, but he's not present, then we call those daddy issues. So that's baggage. When children grow up without a dad or with an absent father or even without a mom, because that's not as common as fatherlessness, but it's still a reality. Females especially take on what we call daddy issues and tend to look for male attention, even if it's negative and unhealthy. And that's baggage. That is going to be taken into a relationship, and it likely will cause you to accumulate more baggage the more relationships that you have. If there is abuse in your childhood that leads to distrust, then that is baggage. There's a lot to this, obviously. And if it's not dealt with, it's baggage that you carry into your relationships, and it tends to affect how you see your spouse, how you treat your spouse, how you conduct your own family affairs within the home, and sometimes even how you handle conflict. Some people come from homes where they don't talk about anything and they sweep everything under the rug, and that's not healthy. And then there's some homes that talk about everything and they bring everything out in the open, and I don't think that's healthy either. So you can learn to pick up baggage from the way that your family handles things because of the dysfunction. But if there's baggage due to emotional abuse, physical abuse, and things like that, you definitely have childhood baggage that you carry into a marriage. So, again, there's a lot more to be said about that. But again, I'm not a psychologist. We are going to discuss what the Bible says about how to deal with some of the issues that arise from these things. But for now, just understand that childhood baggage is a thing. So, even if you get married young, you can take that into your relationships. Financial baggage is the second one. And I think out of all of the baggage out of these three types of baggage, I think this one might be the easiest one to fix, but I don't know that it's the easiest to keep fixed if the person with financial baggage has a spending problem. So it depends on the debt and the habits of the couple. However, financial baggage is the debt that you bring into the relationship. It's your spending habits that you bring into the relationship. If somebody uses buying things or like all these Amazon purchases as a way to fix an emotional problem, then obviously that's baggage, and it's going to continue to accumulate and cause issues in your marriage. It's the credit card debt, it's the credit score, school loans, car loans, all of the above. So when you get married, the debt is taken on by the spouse, because I don't know, if spouses have separate accounts and keep their finances separate. I would say that's probably another issue in and of itself, to keep your finances separate when you get married. So again, it's going to be something that requires habit changes and laying it all out on the table, learning to budget together, and just communicating those things in order for you to deal with the baggage. But I would say, if you're going to get married, financial baggage is something that you definitely don't want to keep from your spouse. If you have debts and you have loans and you have a bad credit score and you want to buy a house with your spouse, that's all going to come up anyway. So it would be better if you're honest about that to begin with, rather than having them find out the hard way and not trust you anymore. So financial baggage, it can be discussed. I think it can be dealt with. And if you work on it, it can probably be an easier an easier aspect of baggage to deal with and move on from, but it all depends upon you. And then the final one is relationship baggage. I think this one can be complicated because the more partners, like sexual partners you've had, the more baggage you'll have. If you've been divorced before, you're going to have emotional baggage. You'll take right into that next relationship. There's no other way around it. The things that you did and the habits you created with the spouse you had before, you're going to carry those into your new relationship, and it's going to affect how you handle conflict with that new spouse. So relationship baggage is unresolved emotional baggage that you take into a new relationship, and it's the habits that you've created in other relationships that you bring into these new ones. And the older you get, the more set in your ways that you become, and these things become how you handle situations and deal with the issues in your new relationship. So it can compound. And we talked about that in the divorce episode. Katie Faust said a lot of times that when people get a divorce, they're just transferring these set of problems into another relationship. And again, the more relationships that you have and the sexual partners that you have, the more baggage that you'll carry into these relationships. But again, if something can be carried, it can be put down. So how do you do that? You have to deal with it. You have to deal with it. So the question is, do you have to tell your spouse about your baggage? Some people think their past is none of their spouse's business because they weren't there. Or, you know what, I'm not that person anymore. And since they weren't in the picture when these relationships took place, it doesn't really matter. We don't have to discuss that. But is that setting your marriage up for failure or success? That would be my question. If I withhold these things from my spouse, is it going to set us up for success, or is it going to set us up for failure? What would be the reason? And then if I'm going to talk to them about these, is that going to help us have a more successful marriage, or is it going to create, or is it going to set us up for failure? I guess it depends on the issue. Although God does save and sanctify us, I believe that we have to be careful what we withhold from our spouses regarding our past, because although sin is forgiven, there are still consequences of our sin. And a lot of times people think that because God has forgiven us for all the things that we've done, we don't feel the repercussions or consequences of our sin. And in some cases that might be true, but in other cases it's not. Galatians 6, 7 through 8 says, "Don't be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a person sows, he will also reap. Because the one who sows to his flesh will reap destruction from the flesh, but the one who sows to the Spirit will reap eternal life from the Spirit." Now, again, we're not talking about God's forgiveness. He does forgive us and does not hold anything against us, but we still have to deal with some of the consequences of our sins at times, because we live in a world that operates by cause and effect. And when we do sin, the consequences of sin are still put in motion. And I mean, think about it. We're still dealing with the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin, even though God forgave them. God covered them with animal skin as a type of what Christ is going to do for us, what he did for us. But the consequence of their actions is still, the ball was rolling, and now we feel the pain of that, and we've all inherited that sin nature. So what am I saying with this? If you want a healthy marriage, there has to be trust. I have heard of some couples agreeing to allow the past to stay in the past and they don't bring it up. If you can do that and say that our lives began together on our wedding day and we'll trust each other from here on out as we commit ourselves to each other, then good. I guess that's your commitment and you can do that. But that has to be communicated, and it has to be something that you both hold to, right? Without any sort of bitterness that sets in. Now, if you want to lay it all out on the table because you know the quote unquote baggage of those past relationships might affect your marriage, and you have to be honest with each other and say, look, I've had some bad relationships. There has been some intimacy with other people that I wish never would have happened, but I'm dealing with that. I want to let you know so you'll understand sometimes if I'm, distant, or sometimes if I'm dealing with that, then you'll get where I'm coming from. If that has to be communicated, then that also should be communicated. I did research this question about specifically sharing your past relationships with your spouse, and to see if you should or if you should not. Just what the consensus is. Not that I think that popular opinion is something that should be considered in this. I don't think that at all. But the information was conflicting. Some say that you should, and some say that you shouldn't. I think it depends on what it is, and it depends on your relationship. And I even asked a couple people in my life, like, hey, what do you think about this? Do you think that you should be laying out all this baggage? And they told me it depends. It depends upon what it is, because sometimes you can share so much that it's detrimental, and then sometimes you can share not enough or nothing at all. And then it comes up because you meet somebody from your past and your spouse is blindsided. So, again, the most important thing about your marriage is being able to trust each other and work through past hurts, even if your spouse isn't the reason for your baggage. Either way, communication is key here, along with wisdom and praying about it. If past issues are going to come up because the baggage involves children from another person, debts, past abuse that affects your intimacy with your spouse, then these things have to be communicated so that you can work through them together, rather than allow the baggage to bog down your marriage and tear you apart. If your spouse doesn't understand you or where you're coming from, then the communication is already going to be, I mean, if there's no understanding, then there's no communication. You're not being able to communicate effectively. So I don't think anybody can really tell you the answer to this question. I think that this is something that you and your spouse have to talk about. And I think you need to deal with it right right up front before you get married, preferably. Now, if you're already married, then, you know, maybe you've already decided on this, or you need to pray about it and think about what your next step is. So what about secrets in marriage? Since we're on the topic of what to divulge to your spouse regarding baggage, I also wanted to touch on secrets in marriage. Should spouses keep secrets from each other? I've talked about this before, but it's been a few years. So let me remind you of the purpose of marriage. Marriage is a covenant between the husband, the wife, and God. The foundation of marriage is built on the fact that God has united them as one flesh, both spiritually and physically. This three-way union is the foundation for a godly marriage. So if you are a Christian, think of your marriage this way. Does this action constitute a godly marriage? Does this secret constitute a godly marriage? Now, again, some spouses keep secrets because they buy things and keep the receipts from their spouse. That's a secret. And we have to ask, does that constitute a godly marriage? If my spouse found out about this, are they going to trust me? That should be the purpose for how we treat our spouse, looking at it as a godly marriage. So keeping secrets is not godly because it ruins trust. After my last episode on divorce, I got a text from Albert, who if you listen to the podcast long enough, he's my podcast editor, but also Albert comes on hopefully quarterly. We have to have him on again soon, and we talk about this often. But he texted me and he reminded me that love is a choice. It is not an emotion or a feeling. And I think that that's a great point because I don't always reiterate that. I don't always drive that point home because in our culture, we think love is I have to fall in love and it has to be this romantic thing. And I think shows like The Bachelor have completely they've ruined that, and they make love look so shallow. And I heard that The Golden Bachelor, which I don't watch The Bachelor anymore, haven't watched it in over a decade because it's filth now. I think it was kind of filth then, but it's gotten way worse. And it's just a bunch of catty women fighting over a man, and he pays for these extravagant dates. Come on. No, he doesn't. The show does. And then the women act like, oh my gosh, look what he planned for me. You didn't plan it. He did not plan it. The producers planned it. The writers planned it for good TV. And so anyways, that's why I don't watch it. But The Golden Bachelor, these older and wiser people got married, and then they're already divorcing after 3 months because they just want to be happy. That's the Western ideal of marriage. If I'm not happy and I don't feel these ooey gooey butterfly feelings of goosebumps, and you're not delivering flowers to me every day, then I don't want you anymore. So Albert says this: Western ideology leads us to accept that you fall in love, then get married. The Bible emphasizes that after you marry, love your spouse. Now, again, that's going to sound odd to us because we choose our spouse because we fall in love with them. But again, if love is a choice and not an emotion, then the goo goo feeling of butterflies and goosebumps is not how we describe love. Now, I fell in love with my husband, then married him. So that's our story, and I did feel butterflies and goosebumps at the beginning, but we've been married for almost 23 years. And I rarely, I don't know that I get goosebumps anymore. I love to see him. I hate traveling without him. I want him around all the time. But we've moved beyond that because that's infatuation. So what I want to do is take 1 Corinthians 13 and put these things into their proper categories of what love is and what love is not, and really show here how love is a choice. It is not an emotion. This does not only pertain to marriage. So please don't get me wrong and just isolate this to marriage only. Okay. It describes agape love, self-sacrificial love. So we are going to do this activity. And as we do, I want you to consider this. If self-sacrificial love is what God calls us to, is keeping things from your spouse for your good or for their good. A lot of times we withhold things because we don't want to talk about it. but that's selfish, or we want to keep our spouse out of it. If it's a hard conversation that benefits the marriage and nurtures trust or helps you move in the direction of healing together, then it has to be talked about. So let's go to this activity of love is and love is not. Let's first read the passage and then we'll categorize the description of love. If I speak 1 Corinthians 13, starting at verse 1 all the way to 8, okay? If I speak human or angelic tongues, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give away all my possessions, and if I give over my body in order to boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, is not boastful, is not arrogant, is not rude, is not self seeking, is not irritable, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. So let's first look at the love is category. Love is patient, kind, it rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, love believes all things, love hopes all things, endures all things, and love never ends. Some translation says never fails. Before we tackle the love is not category, let's look at these for a minute. You could do a word study or look up each of these for depth and study as an activity that you do within your own Bible study. But let's just think on them for a minute together because we don't have time for that in this episode. Patience is a fruit of the Spirit. Notice that. Galatians 5. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self control. So, patience is a fruit of the Spirit, and so is love. So, these are not descriptions of love according to the world standards. Marriage is meant to sanctify us, it is self sacrificial. We talked about this in episode 233. If you need patience in your marriage, ask the Lord because it is a fruit that we bear as we are attached to the vine, Christ. Kindness is also a fruit of the Spirit. So, love is patient, love is kind. Kindness is a virtue that helps us to not only answer, you know, kindly, softly, but it helps us not to be harsh. It helps us think of our spouse's needs and extend a kind word when a harsh answer would be a whole lot easier. I often remind myself that when I am impatient with others, it's not even just with my spouse, especially on the road when I drive. Oh my gosh. No offense to you Southern people, but my goodness, can we drive the speed limit? I think the speed limit in California is faster than the speed limit here in the South, and I am a lead foot, I guess. And I remind myself often, like, Shanda, you have a lot to learn because when you drive, you have a bad attitude. But I tell myself, and I've been thinking about this lately because of this reason, that when I'm impatient with others, it's a reflection of my relationship with God. It causes me to go to the Lord and examine my relationship with Him. And I say, okay, Lord, obviously, I am struggling here to treat others patiently and kindly. They can't even hear me. I'm in my own car, but my attitude is terrible. And I do call them names like, get over you moron, that kind of stuff. And I'm like, you need to evaluate your relationship with the Lord. And I think that that's helpful in our marriage too. Like if I'm harsh with my husband, if I'm impatient with him, if I'm irritable, then I need to go check myself with the Lord. Maybe not think about what he's doing to set me off. And then love rejoices in the truth. That means that we're honest with each other. We come together to get to the bottom of the issues in our marriage. We don't keep secrets and we're honest because when you rejoice in the truth, you can trust one another. And if love bears all things, that means it bears the hard things. We only have to bear something that feels heavy and hard. But when you choose to love, you choose to bear the load together. You believe that even when it's hard, that you can get through it because love believes all things. And if love hopes all things, that means you hope that your marriage can be repaired and be strengthened and that the Lord can work it out because love does not fail. To me, that brings so much more depth than just spouting off the answers in the love is category. So let's look at what love is not. Now, when I do this activity, I usually start where Paul actually says love does not envy, which is like verse 3 or 4. But Paul actually began telling us what love isn't in the first few verses above this. He said that love is not how eloquently you speak. He says human tongues or tongues of angels is how he puts it. I think of it this way. You can be as poetic and articulate as Shakespeare was. That doesn't mean that you love. That just means you make a lot of noise. Proverbs 31:30 says that charm is deceitful. Charm is flattery and all the right words, but it's really manipulative because it's not loving. It's kind of fake. You have to be careful. Next, Paul says that you can be intellectual and have the utmost understanding of things the average person does not understand. But if you don't have love, your intellect is nothing. Like what's it good for, right? He said you can be the most generous and giving person. You can even sacrifice yourself to the best of causes, but if it's without love, you have no gain. I mentioned the church in Ephesus in Revelation in episode 234 and how to rekindle the love. But these few verses here describe that church. They did all the right things, hated false teachings and all of that, but they left their first love, so their works profited nothing. And so that's how Paul starts it off, which I think is super strong language when you think about it. I mean, he's saying you can speak in the tongues of angels, but if you have no love, you just make a lot of noise. You're just loud and obnoxious. And if you are the smartest person in the world, but you don't do all the things that you do by giving away your money and yourself to these causes, if you don't have love when you do that, it's worthless. And who knows if you're doing something in love or not? God does. God knows your motivation. So that must mean that people who do those things without love, it's just selfish. It's to be heard by other people, it's to be seen by other people, but it's not for the good of other people. So then we get to the obvious here. Love does not envy. It's to be jealous over someone else's success when you don't love, or to be jealous over their advantages or their possessions. Wanting what others have will naturally put a wedge between you. I don't know if husbands and wives compete over possessions since they probably share everything, but when it comes to making decisions and wanting the role of leadership, this can definitely get in the way and cause spouses to butt heads, whether it be over their finances or over their children. It can happen if you want what you want and it's not for the good of the marriage or the family. Love does not boast. Boasting is connected to pride. It's self centered and it puffs oneself up. It's connected to envy in that it talks about your accomplishments and successes, but in a way that rubs it in to the person who hasn't accomplished as much or doesn't have what you have. It sets itself up above others. And then it says love is not rude. What does it mean to be rude? It means to be impolite or ill-mannered. I think of obnoxious people who aren't considerate of what they say or how they act when they're being rude. It's not only about how you look when you're rude, like it's about how you make others feel. That's what rude being rude is. It's your joke at someone else's expense. It's putting your feet in their furniture. It's just not respecting them. So, do you allow others to get in line first? Do you hold the door open for others and wait just a little longer? When we're rude, we're not considering the other person. When we consider the other person, we're careful so that we're not rude. You can just see the opposites in these love is and love is not. And so, love is not self seeking. Again, when applying this to marriage, it's not about how your spouse doesn't meet your expectations because you want what you want. It's about understanding each other's strengths and weaknesses and balancing each other out by making up for the other's lack. I mean, this is hard. This is really difficult because you always have to be aware of your own motives and your own self. Why am I doing this? Why am I saying this? It's easy to be self-seeking, and I'm talking from experience because I look out for number 1 too. And it takes intentionality in marriage to not be selfish, to think of somebody else first. And then love is not irritable. This means that you are easily annoyed or angry. Again, this is linked to patience. If you're patient, you're probably not consistently irritable or easily irritable. Again, this is speaking to me because I am imagining myself when I don't get enough sleep. It's just that's when I'm the most irritable. So I recognize myself in some of these things, and I think it's hard to choose. It's hard to choose what's on the love is side. It's hard to choose to be kind. It's hard to choose to always be upfront about things that we need to talk about and discuss in our marriage and be honest about those things. It's easier to want what I want and to fight for what I want. But God asks us to do things that are in opposition to our own nature, but that aligns with His. Why? Because it makes the relationships better. And then finally, love keeps no record of wrongs. This is a huge one for me, or for the baggage issue. It's huge in way of what we were talking about with baggage, because I mean, how many times do you get into arguments and you bring up what happened 3 years ago? This is something I told myself a long time ago. No, you got to stop. So whenever I think of these, this is the number one thing that I thought I really worked on this. This is closely linked to forgiveness and healing. And if you have truly forgiven someone, you have to stop bringing up the wrongs of the past. Now, I know these things are not easy. I keep saying that. They're really hard asks. But again, the way love is displayed has a lot to do with the fruits of the Spirit being produced in our lives. This is something that we have to go to God for. And again, I used to be more of a grudge holder, and my husband can let something go in a second. I like to talk things out, and he likes to move right on past it. It's the way we were raised. But since we've been married, and we learned how to be married. And I think that that's an important aspect of marriage. You have to learn your spouse. Your spouse has to learn you. We learn how each other operates. And then we come together and say, how are we going to operate? Because I come from this home that wants to overshare, and you come from this home that wants to not share at all. How do we discuss these things? And since I've been married, I've learned that not everything requires a conversation before you get over it. You can get over things and move on without talking about all of it. And he's learned that some things have to be addressed so we don't continue in those habits. It takes learning each other and learning how to handle conflict and issues. But once something has been addressed, to rehash it again and again can be detrimental to your marriage. It's like, when are you going to move on? When are you going to get over this already? And that's keeping a record of wrongs if you don't move on. You have to decide to lay it down at some point, or you're just keeping records of wrongs, and your arguments are going to turn into comparing lists or comparison lists rather than resolving conflict. Like, let me tell you what you did. And he'll be like, well, let me tell you what you did. And it's never going to end. The list is only going to get longer because you're going to continue to add to it, right? We have to remember that keeping a record of wrongs is not, it's not choosing to love our spouse. So the main point of this episode is to discuss the baggage that we take into marriage and what we need to disclose to our spouse, or, to our fiance. Hopefully it'll be before you get married that you have this conversation as we launch into this holy covenant of marriage with them. Is it fair to keep things from our spouse that might affect your relationship with them because you have a hard childhood or emotional and financial baggage that may cause trust issues? Like, I don't want to talk about it, so we're not. Well, again, we have to think about how to love our spouse. We have to think about how to show love to them and make sure that there's trust in the marriage. Okay. Not just about how we feel. And then we'll know what to do in those moments when we look at this and say, is this about me or is this about my marriage? Do I need to make sure that my marriage is where it needs to be, or am I just being selfish right now? And I think for the big issues that you and your spouse can't seem to handle without some advice, talk to a pastor or an older and wiser couple in your church who can help walk you through it. It's so good and necessary and biblical to have wise mentors in the church family who can help us in our marriages. You don't always have to go to counseling, professional counseling. You don't always have to go to, like, therapy and all of that, but you can look at an older couple in your church and just say, hey, you guys seem to model a strong marriage. Can we come and just talk to you about some things and get some advice? A lot of times the older want to mentor the younger. I mean, I want to mentor younger women. I just don't know who wants to have a mentor. And so sometimes you have to go seek out who needs a mentor. And sometimes if you need a mentor, you need to go seek them out. So be proactive about it. It's your marriage. And then you can ask the couple, do we need to talk about everything, or should we just forgive each other and come to the fact that this isn't helpful for us and we're going to move on together and away from that? And I think that that's going to be very, very helpful. Podcasts are one thing. People always message me and say, hey, do you know of a person I can listen to for this, or what book you can recommend for that? Podcasts can only go so far. I mean, think about it. How much can I cover in a podcast episode? Not as much as some people need. So you need real life conversations with real life wise people, specifically from your church, and they can help you. If you are not in a church, try to find a strong church locally and get plugged in. There's no reason you should be getting your theology from podcasts all the time, not even mine. These are just supplemental. They are to supplement and to support things that you're already learning, but they're not to replace those things. Okay, so your marriage depends upon it. So with the question, do we have to talk about all the baggage? I guess again it depends. That's something to pray about, something to use wisdom for, and to make sure that you and your husband are communicating, or your wife are communicating those things. And so finally, I want to remind you that 1 Corinthians 13 is not just for husbands and wives. It's agape love, the kind of love we display to all people, including our kids. And that is what we're going to talk about in the next episode: how to create an environment in our homes that nurtures our children to be who God created them to be. And I think you're going to love it. I do love talking about these things because God made family and he gave parents influence over their children so that moms and dads can raise godly children who shine bright in this dark world. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com, and I'll catch you on the next one.